Katie Ives is the editor-in-chief at the Alpinist magazine, and her writing has appeared in numerous publications, including the New York Times, Outside, the Rumpus, and Adventure Journal, as well as anthologies Rock, Paper, Fire, The Best Mountain and Wilderness Writing, and Waymaking, an anthology of women's adventure writing, poetry, and art. In 2016, she received the H. Adams Carter Literary Award from the American Alpine Club. She has participated in the Banff Mountain Wilderness Writing Program and served as a judge for the Boardman Tasker Award and a jury member, panelist, and panel moderator at the Banff Mountain Book Festival. She lives in Cambridge, Vermont. Imaginary Peaks is her debut book. And without further ado, Katie Ives.
Well, thank you. So, I was going to start off by talking about the basic story of the Riesenstein hoax, which was the initial inspiration for this, I guess it was like almost decades-long immersion in a kind of a personal quest for imaginary mountains. And to give some background, the geographer Peter Bishop once described imaginary peaks as part of an archaeology of imaginative landscapes. To start to understand such places, he said, you first have to find your way inside. Sometimes their presence is revealed only by a single clue, such as a word or a phrase, but these details are doorways. So this was my doorway. In June 1962, which was long before I was born, a black and white photo of surreal peaks appeared inside the pages of Summit magazine. At the time, few American climbers had ever seen anything like these mountains before, at least beyond their fantasies and dreams. Sheer walls rose abruptly, stacked one atop the other, like the ramparts of an extraterrestrial city. Hanging glaciers, dark shadows, and billowing clouds hinted at some cold, stormy, faraway place. A multitude of rippling cracks suggested countless routes for hard ascents. A caption suggested an area that seemed remote but real. The unclimbed summit of Riesenstein, approximately 8,100 feet near Prince Rupert in British Columbia. It can be reached in 2 days by bushwhacking up the Kloati River. Who will be the first to climb it? Below the photo appeared an article about 3 Austrians named Makler, Bisserlich, and Kronefer, who reportedly reached 2 of the lower peaks on the skyline. They tried multiple times to climb to the main summit, only to be stopped by avalanches and storms. Still, the Austrians declared that somebody might get to the apex one day if that future climber were willing to drill just a few bolts on a short, polished rock wall that stymied their own final attempt at the highest point. So this is the original photo of the Riesenstein from Summit magazine. And accompanying that article was a map, hand-drawn, that depicted the surrounding area, with hatch marks that indicated the sharp summits, and striped blobs that designated 4 seemingly unnamed glaciers. Arrows indicated an area somewhere between the Kloati River and the Skana River. Above everything else, in all caps, the words unexplored area were scrawled above what appeared to be a previously strangely unnoticed blank on modern maps. Entranced, readers pored over Canadian maps, only to realize that no such peaks existed in British Columbia. Although the Skana River flowed through the province, Kloati was actually the name of a glacier in Washington state, not a river. And Riesenstein, which means giant stone in German, was the name of a cluster of boulders near the ruined castle towers of Heidelberg, Germany. The entire article was a hoax. In the American Alpine Journal, 2 Gunks climbers, Al DeMaria and Pete Geiser, later recalled, obviously Summit magazine had fallen victim to someone's sense of humor, yet there were the pictures. Palpable mountains, they must have had some existence. But where? Chamonix, Africa, Asia, the moon. The Riesenstein appeared doomed to join the ranks of other mythical and fabulous regions like Shangri-La. I first came across the story of the Riesenstein in 2011 when I was reading Andy Selter's book of North American climbing history, Ways to the Sky. For me, the tale appealed to a lifelong fascination with imaginary mountains. Growing up in the lowlands of Massachusetts since childhood, I'd had recurring dreams of an invisible high peak that rose above the farm fields and rolling woods of my hometown. In Mountains of the Mind, Robert Macfarlane famously described all mountains as imagined into existence. Human fantasies have a way of accumulating even on real peaks, coating the topography with drifting layers of symbols, like crystals of snow, melting and freezing into new forms. But imaginary mountains seem to slip the bounds of cartography altogether, reflecting, perhaps even more deeply, the shapes of human longing and fear. To examine the history of imaginary mountains is to venture deep into the conscious and unconscious heritage of mountaineering, exploration, and desire. In Landscapes of the Sacred, theology professor Belden C. Lane once wrote, "It lingers yet in imagination and fragment of dream, the abode where mountains finally reach their greatest height. What is this inner need we humans have for the mountain seen within? In cultures around the world, there are tales of mythical mountains assuming far more grandeur than any found on map or chart. The word imaginary is, of course, an inadequate one, because what is fantasy to one individual or culture or time is a reality to another. In many traditions, mountains have served as bridges between the earthly and the divine. Medieval European mapmakers filled in areas beyond their knowledge with lands of rumor and myth, at times locating the Garden of Eden at the eastern edges of Asia, atop a summit so high that it might have escaped the waters of the flood. Some early Islamic cartographers depicted Mount Quoth as an emerald band of peaks that encircled the entire world. Meru, a sacred peak in Hindu, Buddhist, and Jaina religions, is shaped like a tree in some depictions. It spreads its roots into the underworld and lifts its branches to the heavens. And as late as the 16th century, to explain why compasses point north, a Flemish photographer depicted a black magnetic rock peak at the North Pole. These are, of course, only a few of countless examples. Mythic ranges have long flourished along perceived thresholds and frontiers, where visions of the familiar and unfamiliar push up against each other like tectonic plates. During the 17th and 18th centuries in Britain and France, the genre of imaginary voyages surged just as published accounts of real European explorers began to replace them. As social sciences professor Paul Longley Arthur explains in Virtual Voyages, it is as though the writers were aware that this point in history provided a final, fleeting, and rapidly diminishing opportunity for imaginative revelry. Then in 1749, the French cartographer Jean-Baptiste Bourguignon d'Anville removed most of the mythic mountains from his map of Africa, where neat rows of shaded triangular mounds once symbolized reputed peaks. He left empty, flat spaces. To d'Anville, a blank on the map signified a place where none of his fellow Europeans had yet been. Can a faithful historian who finds a vacancy or interruption in any series of events supply it by his own imagination, he asked. To him, the answer was no. In the process of erasing fantasy ranges that previous European cartographers had imagined, d'Anville cleared away vast expanses of projected Western myths. And yet, as English professor Siobhan Carroll notes in An Empire of Air and Water, the disappearance created another illusion, a visual terra nullius, a no person's land, invitingly open for colonial appropriation. So here, this is an early map of Africa, and it's filled with mountains that this European cartographer imagined existed there. And then Jean-Baptiste Bourguignon d'Anville, with his concept of blanks on the maps, removed all the imaginary peaks and left blanks, even though, of course, there were real towns and real mountains and real people living there. During the 19th and early 20th century, alongside the spread of steamships and trains, imperial expeditions, and mass travel, Western cartographers inked in those seemingly blank spaces with territorial lines and claims. To European writers, imaginary mountains seemed to retreat into ever more distant, higher places. By 1933, British novelist James Hilton situated his vision of a lost earthly paradise, Shangri-La, near a peak that glimmered like a shaft of moonlight, somewhere in the Kunlun, perhaps near the borders of China and Tibet, beyond the demystifying reach of modern surveyors. There, the inhabitants of Hilton's fictional Shangri-La lived much longer than normal human lifespans in a utopian society, safe from the catastrophes of World War. Hilton's book became a bestseller, and in The Myth of Shangri-La, Professor Peter Bishop described its persistent appeal in the West. The fantasy of Shangri-La can seem, like all utopias, as a memory trace, perhaps, of earlier idealized spiritual communities. The story could reflect a desire for a lost mountaintop Eden, or it could offer a readily consumable, albeit distorted, version of Buddhist ideas of sacred and hidden lands. The lore of Shangri-La also reveals something of the unseemly side of imaginary geographies. In a 2011 article, Alpine Paradise, Japanese mountaineer Tomatsu Nakamura recounted an expedition to Yunnan province in China, where Chinese developers had built a city and named it Shangri-La, complete with artificial Tibetan villages. It was as though the original Tibetan significances of the land had been buried, in part, beneath the pages of Hilton's fantasy. So this was a major event in the history of imaginary mountains and mountain literature. It was the climb of a very real mountain. As European countries recovered from World War II, national expeditions marched inexorably on the world's biggest real peaks. Old daydreams began to dissolve into the dusty glaciers and broken scree of base camps, the shattered blocks and indigo chasms of ice falls, and finally the upper regions of sharp wind and thin air. In 1950, Annapurna became the first 8,000-meter summit to succumb. 3 years later, climbers Tenzing Norgay and Edmund Hillary stood atop Everest. For Tenzing Norgay, as his son Norbu later told me, the first ascent of the Earth's highest peak felt like a pilgrimage. But for many British newspapers, celebrated the climb as if it were a definitive conquest, a triumph for their own nation, displaying the story across their front pages alongside articles about the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. For some writers and readers of mountain literature, amid the nationalistic fervor, it seemed as if one of the final refuges for the unknown had been lost. I'd always imagined Everest as the last inviolate spot, declared a character in a popular 1950s mystery novel, Wildfire at Midnight by Mary Stewart. The dream of inviolate heights lived on in fiction. And here's a photo of Renee Duval's book, Mount Analog, which was when I was working on the book. Anytime I told a climber I was writing a book about imaginary mountains, they immediately wanted to know if I was talking about this book. First printed in 1950 after the author's death. It's certainly still a cult classic today. And in the book, Duval describes a mountain higher than Everest. Its summit must be inaccessible, he wrote, but its base accessible to human beings. It must exist geographically. The door to the invisible must be visible. Duval explained that this island peak had resisted the discovery of map makers thus far because it was formed of material that could create a curvature of space and make itself invisible. Like the writers of imaginary voyages, Duval drew a hazy line between fact and fiction, science and myth, reality and desire. In a letter to a literary critic, he claimed that he'd actually found the doorway into the mountain's hidden world himself, suggesting the peak was, in a spiritual, psychological, or even physical sense, entirely real. It's another famous moment in mountain literature to do with imaginary peaks, the Ascent of Rum Doodle. The idea of a mountain higher than Everest appeared again in another novel from the 1950s by British author W.E. Bowman. Set once more on a fictional peak higher than Everest, the story served as a parody of mountaineering conquests in the Himalaya, and it is partly in this tradition the Riesenstein hoax came about, a desire to use a practical joke to get mountaineers to think more critically about their underlying preconceptions and motivations. And it's worth remembering the context out of which these imaginary mountains became so popular in the 1950s and early 1960s. You could sort of see what the real geography looked like for many Americans. In the years after World War II, with the burgeoning of highways, automobile ownership, and suburban sprawl, the world appealed increasingly shrunken and homogenized, a geography of nowhere, as the author James Howard Kunstler famously called it. By the early 1960s, when the Riesenstein hoax took place, most of the summits in the lower 48 had already been climbed, but the remote northern ranges still seemed to many American climbers as the last frontier, an icy white blank on the edges of their imaginations. It was also a time when the imaginary worlds of science fiction and fantasy had a powerful countercultural draw. In a preface to J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, Peter S. Beagle described the 60s as years when millions of people grew aware that industrial society had become paradoxically unlivable. The word progress lost its ancient holiness, and escape stopped being comically obscene. Lovers of Middle Earth want to go there. And there were countries full of imaginary snowy peaks. In Tolkien's book, The Hobbit, the song that awakens Bilbo Baggins' sense of adventure starts with the now famous words, "Far over the misty mountains, cold." And one thing that I found as I was researching Riesenstein hoax was common both among the people who were involved in creating the hoax and among the people who became obsessed with it was a love of J.R.R. Tolkien. Which brings us to the Hoaxers. I always thought some of them had a kind of a Hobbit-like appearance. So today we know who was behind the Riesenstein hoax. The word Cloati may have been intended as a sly clue. All three of the original conspirators were mountaineers who had lived and climbed in Washington state. Austin Post, a photographer and glaciologist, was responsible for the name Cloati becoming affixed to a real Cascade Glacier before he gave the same name to the imaginary river of the Riesenstein. Ed LaChapelle, another glaciologist, was known for his snow science and avalanche research. And Harvey Manning, a conservationist and author of the classic mountaineering textbook, Freedom of the Hills, had a predilection, then only known to his friends, for coming up with elaborate pranks to fool other climbers. By 2011, when I began researching the hoax, Harvey and Ed had both passed away, but Austin and I exchanged a few emails, and I learned the following version of the story from him. In the early 1960s, Austin had flown over the interior ranges of Alaska, collecting pictures for Glacier Ice, a book he was working on with Ed. After returning to Seattle, he shared his aerial photos with Ed and Harvey, and they amused themselves by pointing out potential routes on the unfamiliar peaks. A cluster of otherworldly rock walls caught their gaze. They realized that few, if any, climbers had ever seen them. One of the men uttered in a tone of hushed reverence, "Ah, the Riesenstein," and thus the hoax began. Austin died in 2012. Several years later, I spoke with one of Harvey's friends, Dale Cole, who explained to me that the Riesenstein was actually part of a larger series of hoaxes that Harvey had designed to create messages about the direction that he felt the mountaineering world was heading. And this is the first of Harvey's well-known hoaxes, although there were certainly others. His first target for his first known major prank was the growing outdoor industry of the post-war years, which he felt was starting to become too pretentious, selling products for prices that were too high and excluding people who lacked means. While drinking homebrew one night, Harvey and Dale wrote a fake story about a high-tech sleeping bag as a parody of pseudo-scientific ads. A tube inserted into an army surplus mask would conduct a person's breath into a container and through a calcium oxide filter. This chamber would, in theory, convert the moist air into heat. Climbers and hikers could theoretically assemble the so-called sleeping system at home at little expense, apart from the calcium oxide, which the two authors lamented was generally produced only for Cold War missile research. To their delight, Summit magazine published the story as a feature article with no indication at all that it was a joke. When a real gear manufacturer wrote a letter to the editor attempting to debunk the sleeping system, Harvey and his friends produced a slew of replies defending it, attributed to a wide range of invented people, from professor of chemistry at Willamette to an old trapper. Since Harvey was working as a traveling textbook salesman at the time, he posted the fake letters in various towns along his route, so they would appear to be coming from different addresses. He and his friends kept the hoax alive for several months until the Summit editors apparently got fed up and decided to stop publishing their letters. In a private letter to a friend, Ted Beck, Harvey explained that the sleeping system was merely a test. The next practical joke would be more ambitious, he said. He would fool American mountaineers into chasing after a fabulous, allegedly unknown destination somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. So this is before the Riesenstein. This was his first imaginary mountain, his first major imaginary mountain hoax. And this is how it came about. In 1959, Dale and Harvey were talking around the campfire in the Cascades. Before them, the swirled white and gray stone of Southeast Mox Peak rose like a surreal castle tower. Gazing at the east face, Harvey decided to transform the real Southeast Mox into a fictitious, no-name peak. He would then submit another fake story about it to a climbing journal to prove a second point, his belief that post-war climbers had become too fixated on first ascents and self-promotion, losing their respect for the environment and forgetting the real value of the wild. So there's No Name Peak. This is Southeast Mox transformed. Dale drew dotted lines to indicate the routes that some imaginary climbers had taken on No Name Peak. He also created an altered map, adding a no-name creek that led to the base of No Name Peak. And there's the map. Harvey then wrote an article about the claimed discovery of No Name Peak, supposedly written by a mountaineer named Paul Williams, which was in fact the name of his non-climbing father-in-law, who had no idea this hoax was happening. Because of the density of Cascades forests, some readers might believe in a mountain that remained hidden from official mapmakers and aspiring climbers. And thus, Harvey hoped ambitious peak baggers would set out in vain to try to claim the first ascent of this mountain, only to realize that their quest was merely a wild goose chase. This time, Harvey's intended target, was the venerable American Alpine Journal, the journal of record of mountaineering itself. But he ended up missing the print deadline, although the editor, Ad Carter, wrote the purported Mr. Williams a note, urging him to be more timely with his future reports, especially if Mr. Williams ever actually managed to get to the top of this no-name peak. So having missed the American Alpine Journal deadline, Harvey and Dale then sent the article to Summit Magazine again, our old reliable, as Dale was starting to call it, where it appeared in May 1960 with the altered map and photo that showed the routes of imaginary attempts by Williams and his friends. And that's how the article looked. The editors contributed a caption strikingly similar to the one they would later add to the Riesenstein article. Who will be the first to climb this 3,000-foot Great Wall of No Name Peak in the northern Cascade region of Washington? And according to his correspondence, Harvey was hoping that Fred Beckey would start thrashing into the wilderness trying to make the first ascent of No Name Peak. But it turned out Fred, of course, had actually already climbed the Mox just by a different route, and that he knew perfectly well that this was not No Name Peak. Despite the difficulty of bushwhacking, the real version of No Name Peak was relatively close to Seattle, where many mountaineers lived. A month later, another Cascade climber, D. Molinar, wrote a letter to Summit explaining the real name and location of No Name Peak, aka Mox Peaks or Twin Spires. Not realizing that the alleged Paul Williams article was a hoax, Molinar expressed his surprise that anyone could become as geographically confused as Paul Williams and his friends appeared to have been. Since by coincidence, Paul Williams was also the name of a real Northwest mountaineer at the time, as well as the name of Harvey's non-climbing father-in-law, some future historians would likewise assume that the article was about a genuine, though error-ridden expedition by an actual climber. And some of those historians would continue to think that this expedition had actually taken place until I innocently emailed them into 2015 saying, so I'm doing some research into the No Name Peak hoax. And they were like, wait, that was a hoax. So that was kind of fun. Anyway, this No Name Peak hoax would turn out to be very good practice for Harvey's next one, an enigma that would take years for anyone to solve. One of the reasons that these hoaxes were possible was that back then it was a lot harder to fact-check mountaineering stories. There were no satellite maps or readily available internet photos. Errors and gaps remained in some printed alpine cartographies. And Summit Magazine, founded in 1955, was still the only monthly US climbing publication. Mountaineering communities were more disconnected from each other than they are now. News and rumor traveled slowly, fragments spread by word of mouth, were reported in regional bulletins and annual club journals. The only source of information about the topographic details of a particular obscure peak might be the climbers who claimed to have climbed it. So in October 2014, I got a chance to meet the editors of Summit Magazine who published the Wiesenstein hoax, and they were living in Bear Lake, California. By then, they'd long since retired from journalism, but they still lived in a house where they produced the magazine, a structure that was built on and partly out of a cluster of stone crags. And surrounding this house were sort of all these alcoves of boulders where they would set up top ropes to teach new climbers, where they would do boulder problems. And one of the more challenging boulder problems was the traverse of the house, where you would traverse the crags that the house itself was on top of without touching the ground. So I got to try that out while I was there. And I did not complete the traverse of the house successfully, unfortunately. But this was a relatively isolated place partway up a mountaintop. And it was isolated for a reason, not just because it was this dream climber's house in the middle of a boulder garden, but also because the same lack of connectedness that made it hard for them to check facts also helped them conceal facts about themselves. Back in the 1950s, they were worried that people wouldn't buy their magazine if readers knew that it was run by women. So they hid their gender on the masthead behind Helen Kilness's initials and Jean Crenshaw's masculine sounding first name. By the time people figured out that the editors were in fact women, the magazine was already established. The less people knew about us, Jean later told me, the easier it was to work. When I asked Jean about the Wiesenstein, she explained, people would often try to play tricks on me. People liked to do that to us. And then she laughed with a glint in her eye that was at once mysterious and mischievous, that left me wondering whether she'd been going along with Hardy's hoaxes all the time. That's the sort of thing that I would do to someone else, she said to me. So, where are the real peaks? Oh, oops, there they are. Yeah, so that's Helen Kilness and Green Crenshaw back in 2014, and sadly they've since passed away. Yeah, so where are the real peaks of the Wiesenstein? A few years after the Wiesenstein article appeared, two separate groups of American climbers solved the mystery almost simultaneously. David Roberts, then a Harvard student, and Don Jensen, who had recently dropped out, were looking for a goal for their next expedition. David was making regular visits to the Boston Museum of Science, where the director, Brad Washburn, kept an immense collection of aerial photos of Alaskan peaks. Feeling both entranced and daunted by pictures of the west face of Mount Huntington, David turned to topographic maps instead to look for other options in some of the lesser-known regions of the Alaska Range. Southwest of Denali, he noticed a mysterious cluster of peaks. None of the summits were above 9,000 feet, but the density of the contour line hinted at steep walls thousands of feet high. A half-forgotten image from Summit Magazine reemerged in his mind. These must be the Wiesenstein. David later asked Brad Washburn why he had no photos of these spires, since he had taken pictures of so many other mountains in Alaska. Washburn replied that he had indeed seen the mountains from the air, but the regional weather was simply too awful for climbing. They call that area the asshole of the Alaska Range, Washburn told David. But the peaks were far from undiscovered. In 1898, a US geologist, Josiah Spur, had glimpsed them from a pass and called them Cathedral Mountain, a name that later morphed into Cathedral Spires, or Kichatna Spires, the later name based off the latter name, based off the Alaska Native name for them. A year later, another explorer, Joseph Heron, created a detailed map of the area, and he named three of the individual peaks, Gurney, Augustin, and Lewis. And nobody seems to know who the original Gurney, Augustin, and Lewis were. David Roberts told me that he thought that maybe they were Heron's drinking buddies. So this is the Heron Map from 1898. And long before Spur and Heron, Alaska Native people, of course, had created their own maps of the surrounding region, composed of stories, songs, and geographic names. And this is from Champete's Alaska, which is an Alaska Native atlas of the Cook Inlet area and includes the Kitchatna Spires. And here, the authors of this atlas took the original Heron Map and then they put numbers on it corresponding to the original Alaska Native name. So you can see the name for the mountains and the river. It did appear true, however, that even though these mountains were known to Indigenous people, to hunters, and to explorers, none of the walls had been climbed. And so David and Don decided that they might stay in Alaska to explore the peaks. And once they'd completed the west face of Huntington with two other young Harvard students, Matt Hale and Ed Byrne. That summer, after weeks of storms, they completed the first ascent of the west face of Huntington, a story that has now become one of the classic stories of mountain literature. But as they descended into the twilight, rappel setup failed and Ed fell to his death. There was no longer any question of continuing to the Kitchatanas. Once the surviving team members gathered at base camp, they stamped out the signal for the pilot Don Sheldon to pick them up, the start of a journey back to a world where they would have to share unspeakable news. Meanwhile, a second team of climbers had already found their way into the Reason Sign. Here's two of the protagonists from that second team. By sheer chance, sometime after the hoax was published, a New York climber named Branell Bergen had been looking through a box of Austin Post photos during a visit to the American Geographical Society in New York City. One picture of rock walls in the Kitchatanas appeared strangely familiar. There it was, the giant stone, the Reason Sign, he concluded. Bang, there it was. Branell located the peaks on a map of Alaska, and he shared the news with a number of his friends, including some of the Bulgarians, a group of climbers who were then active, one might say notoriously active, at the Gunks. As the story is often told, the Bulgarians revolted against the conservative approach of the Appalachian Mountaineering Club at the time, with antics that became legendary, including tipping over a car that they believed belonged to an ANC member. In fact, that car actually belonged to Branell Bergen. But fortunately for them, he forgave them, and he told them about the Reason Sign and the Kitchatanas, and they began plotting a trip to the real location of the Reason Sign. The 1965 Kitchana Expedition Team, which became the first climbing expedition to the Reason Sign, real location, eventually included Al Di Maria, Pete Geiser, Claude Zuhl, John Hudson, George Bloom, and Aaron Snyder. Pete recalls feeling in tune with the spirit of the hoax. There was a kind of class warfare of a sort, he later said to me, where the early dominance of mountaineering by the wealthy was rapidly breaking down as climbing began to be done by more working class folks like the Bulgarians. It seemed to us that a lot of the climbing journals had these stories about climbs in exotic locations, seemingly out of reach for us, where for all we knew, they could have just made the whole thing up with a few selected photos. But hoax or not, these mountains were real, and even better, accessible by VW. And here's the VW bus that they took to the mountains. In July 1965, Al, Pete, and Claude crammed bags and mattresses into the back of a VW microbus, and they left New York City for Alaska, stopping in Minnesota along the way to pick up George. They met with two other members of the team, Aaron and John in Dawson Creek at the southern end of the Alaska Highway, and then continued north for 1,000 miles across unpaved road. Icy air wafted from distant glaciers. Gazing at vast expanses, Claude imagined that they were driving off the maps altogether. This treasure hunt was real, he thought. After arriving in Talkeetna, they boarded the bush plane, flown again by Don Sheldon. Here's the plane. They had picked out a route on the mountain later known as North Triple Peak, a blend of rock, snow, and ice that they thought would be similar to their experiences in the Canadian Bugaboos. But Don couldn't find a place to land on the glacier below it, so he dropped them off instead on the other side of a sheer ridgeline. And there they are. There's base camp. The reality of the place seemed even more alien than they'd imagined. Within a few square miles, there were more than 40 summits between 7,000 and 9,000 feet. Pale amber and ash-colored granite faces swept high into the air amid flying buttresses, long arcs of cracks and couloirs, strange nooks of sudden chasms, stone windows and caves. Glaciers emanated from the center in rays of white, separated by sharp rock spines. In the American Alpine Journal, Al and Pete later wrote, "The immensity of the wall suddenly took on the proportions of an absurd joke. The summits appeared the epitome of inaccessibility. For a warm-up, Pete, Al, and John chose what appeared to be the easiest nearby summit. A blizzard whirled through the air, and they spent half a day floundering up a long snow slope up a 7,270-foot mountain, its icy crystals clumped like wet down feathers. For the next 10 days, they tried to find a way over the ridgeline and into the cirque where they originally planned to climb. When they finally got to the top of Lowest Saddle, the rock on the other side turned out to be too rotten to descend safely. A clatter of falling stones cut one of their ropes. In horror, they called the spot Gashly Crumb Cole, after a book by Edward Gorey that illustrates the death of 26 children, one for each letter of the alphabet. They realized now that they were essentially trapped in the place where the plane had originally dropped them off, and they named it Coolsack Glacier, or cul-de-sac or dead end, play on words. They resigned themselves to spending the rest of the trip just trying to climb some of the most attainable of the nearby peaks until the pilot returned for them. Gradually, they drew their own map of the place, choosing names that reflected the absurdity of the adventure. One peak they called After You. As Claude explained, "So I can truthfully say that I named a mountain after you. No need to thank me." Since the unattainable walls appeared like the ultimate expression of their aspirations, they named another summit A Spire, another play on words. Gazing out from the top of one 7,900-foot peak, they realized just how narrow the ridge crests were, almost like mere curtains of stone. Yet another unusual aspect that would increase the difficulty of climbing there. Later, a thick mist descended as Al, Aaron, and George crossed the final snowy ridge to the summit of a 7,785-foot peak they later called Bulgarian Peak. Unable to see, they spent the night in the open, only to be caught in an increasingly violent storm. As the same dark clouds rushed towards John and Pete, they were skidding across a steep, glassy slope of ice above a sharp cliff near the top of an 8,250-foot summit. It was like climbing the roof of a house, Pete recalls, a very slippery, steep roof. By the time everyone had managed to return to base camp, gusting winds and heavy sleet had flattened the tents. After repitching the tents, they tried to sleep. Late that night, Pete recalls, an enormous low organ note that filled the valley. The only thing that I can attribute that sound to was that the head wall of the cirque had a narrow, giant elliptical hole. During a relative lull in the storms, John and Pete reached the apex of the 7,785-foot peak. Making their way over the fracture lines of past avalanches, they felt relieved that dense clouds and soft rain hid the void below. At last, one day, a brief window of blue sky opened, and the small plane buzzed again like a silver gnat, as Claude put it. Dawn had finally arrived to pick them up. In the American Alpine Journal, Al and Pete wrote that just as they left, clouds and storms began to reclaim the Riesenstein. Today, Pete calls the experience a harsh but indirect lesson to always be humble in the face of nature and reality. I felt like I'd been there. The mountains were unperturbed. They were just there. And we could sort of live in their there-ness for a while. Then we'd have to go. The longing remained. Why is this desire part of our collective psyches, he asked, about imaginary mountains and real ones? And then he tried to answer, I don't believe it's something that's just restricted to people who climb. There's always that mystery of what lies over the horizon. Those are a few scenes from the expedition. When the American Alpine Journal and Summit published the 1965 trip report, the editors replaced the Bulgarians' peak names with numbers because they thought the Bulgarian names might actually be obscene. In fact, they were simply, most of them were simply names that were private references or taken from Edward Gorey's book, and they weren't actually obscene at all. And today, most of the peaks have even newer names. Summit also reprinted the original Riesenstein hoax photo. Below the image, now correctly captioned, they noted the incorrect information from the 1962 article, which they attributed to the work of an unnamed practical jokester. A year later, David Roberts got his chance to go to the area, along with Art Davidson, Dave Johnson, Peter Meiser, and Rich Milliken. They learned from the Bulgarians' report, and they knew how to avoid getting stuck on the Coolsack Glacier, or the cul-de-sac glacier, as it began to be called. They also had more of the mountaineering skills they needed to climb such high, storm-blasted walls. By the end of the trip, the members of the 1966 expedition had climbed the highest summit in the area, an 8,985-foot ice-crested monolith, which they called Kichatna Spire. And this photo is actually from a modern expedition, but I picked it because I thought it was beautiful. In 1968, David published the first mini guidebook to the real Kichatnas in Summit magazine with the intention, as he put it, to shortcut for future visitors the problems of a Spire's expedition by chronicling what is known about the place, and to entice serious mountaineers with a prospect of some of the most exciting mountains on Earth. Such promises of a hidden wonderland soon lured others. Over time, the Kichatnas no longer seemed like the epitome of inaccessibility, as Alan Peet had once called them. In 1976, Mike Graber and his partners established Illusory Ridge on Middle Triple Peak, one of the original lines that Ed LaChapelle, Austin Post, and Harvey Manning had inked on the Riesenstein hoax photo. It was as if the fictitious mountains were emerging at last, out of the imaginary and the sublime, and into the attainable, the measurable, and the true. By the time I began my research in 2011, the quest for the right Riesenstein seemed mostly forgotten, reduced to a few paragraphs in old journals and history books, kept alive in scattered memories of aging mountaineers. Yet today, I still can't help feeling that the mystery hasn't been fully solved, that the story is ongoing, and that there are many more questions to unfold. During the mid-20th century, a group of French writers began practicing what they called psychogeography, to explore the connections between landscapes and human minds. Through various walking games, such as using the map of one city to navigate another and thus get deliberately lost, they sought to break free of predictable patterns of travel and perception, to ignore established routes and boundaries, and to find a more intimate sense of place. I've come to think of the Riesenstein hoax as a kind of mountaineering psychogeography, a fake map that led its users to arrange with another name in another country, a map that could unsettle climbers' preconceptions about what wild places mean. But there have also long been other kinds of stories about mountain quests. Since the early days, as Western mountaineers sought to claim superlative heights, untrodden summits, or fabulous riches, their searches often remained entangled with legacies of colonialism and imperialism. But explorers from other cultures have also continued to look for mythic peaks and places, and their accounts suggest alternative cartographies of dreams, additional ways of approaching the world's mysteries without trying to conquer them. In 1917, a Tibetan visionary named Sira Khandru traveled to Amni Machen, a sacred mountain in the Kunlun Range, around the same region where the novelist James Hilton would set his imaginary Shangri-La more than a decade and a half after Sira Khandru's own pilgrimage there. Although modern measurements describe Amni Machen as less than 6,300 meters high, some Western climbers once mistakenly thought it might be higher than Everest as well. But Sira Khandru wasn't thinking about trying to get to the top of some giant unclimbed peak, nor was she trying to satisfy any personal longing for dominion, fulfillment, or gain. Instead, according to her memoirs, she was looking for something inside the mountain. After opening a doorway into the peak, she wrote, she found a treasure that could help ease other people's suffering, and she compensated the land for anything she removed from it by leaving her own offerings in return. Similar tales exist throughout the Himalaya of hidden lands called Bayul, at times concealed inside the walls of snowy Himalayan peaks, places of great natural beauty, of lush green meadows and giant cascades that could provide sanctuaries for people in need of refuge, and that contain spiritual teachings and healing plants. These places, according to tradition, can only be opened by the right people at the right times. In 1962, the very same year that the Riesenstein hoax appeared in Summit, another Tibetan Buddhist teacher, Tulshik Lingpa, and his followers began a long expedition in search of a Bayul, one that was said to exist inside the massif of Kanchenjunga, an 8,586-meter peak on the borders of India and Nepal. An avalanche struck some members of the group on the southwest flank of the mountain, and Tulshik Lingpa died. Some people thought that the moment to open the Beul hadn't arrived yet. Others continued to believe that the Beul is more a state of mind than a specific place, or else that it's some combination of inner and outer landscapes. In the introduction to Ian Baker's book, The Heart of the World, the Dalai Lama wrote, the Beul are not places to escape the world, but to enter it more deeply. Sanctuaries that deepen awareness of hidden regions of the mind and spirit. The geographic location ultimately matters less than the journey itself. Since I published the book, a lot of people have asked me what I think imaginary mountains represent. The short answer is that they seem to mean something different within each culture and to each seeker. To the theology writer, Belden C. Lane, dreams of imaginary peaks might represent the mountain of the undiscovered self, as described by Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, their topographies and stories reflecting inmost desires. But fictional places can also remind us of the ultimately subjective and unreliable elements of all maps. Maps can't render the three-dimensional landforms accurately on two-dimensional planes, capturing all the infinite and shifting complexities of ice and stone. They can't fully express the passage of time or the vagaries of a cartographer's emotions. And as the map historian J.B. Harley once wrote, far from holding up a simple mirror of nature, maps also redescribe the world in terms of relations of power and cultural practices, preferences, and priorities. All too often, the dominant maps and narratives of mountaineers have erased the geographic knowledge of Indigenous people, replacing their earlier place names and stories with new imported symbols and fantasies. In some ways, the tale of the Riesenstein reflects some of these problems. Yet by comparing physical and imagined geographies, we can also gaze more closely at what appears in the gaps between what is represented and what is not. And we can ask ourselves what it might mean to unmake the maps, to search for everything that has escaped from them and everything that seemed lost. As the fantasy writer Joan Aiken once said, why do we want alternate worlds? It's a way of making progress. You have to imagine something before you do it. In another email, Dale Cole once told me, Harvey Manning and I spent much time thinking about how we could make the world a better place. A hoax now and then seemed a likely way. To explain what he meant, Dale added that Harvey loved to quote a few lines from the poet A.E. Housman. Ale man, ale's the stuff to drink, for fellows whom it hurts to think. Look into the pewter pot to see the world as the world's not. Imaginary ranges invite us to see the world as it is not, but they could also show us how the world could be. And once you begin to look for them, you start to see them everywhere. Each furrowed crag and hill has its own local myths. Each square of map conceals forgotten phantom heights. Each human mind contains innumerable ranges, sparkling like starlight and like snow. The real Kachatnas of Alaska have been climbed, but no one, it seems, has ever reached the last invisible summit of the Riesenstein. And as the editors of Summit magazine once asked, who will be the first to climb it? So I had, in terms of like a Q&A, I thought I kind of had my own question. And I think one of the things that I've really enjoyed about researching imaginary mountains, dream mountains, cartographic errors, exploration hoaxes, is finding out that a lot of times readers have their own stories that haven't necessarily appeared in history books. So I was curious to hear if anyone in the audience had, stories of non-existent peaks that, that they've seen in their dreams, or times that they stumbled upon areas that somehow didn't make it on the map, or errors that they found in maps that reminded them of how much more exists beyond, what's been described in guidebooks. So I don't know if there's anybody who has a story that they'd like to share.
And you can feel free to unmute yourself and share your story, or raise your hand and I can call on you and you can share your story, or you can drop it in the chat.
And maybe if I can't see people's too well.
If you stop sharing the screen, then we will see everybody's faces.
There we go. Yeah.
Anyone have an imaginary peak story? Paul, you're writing a book about place names. Do you have any?
I don't know that I have imaginary peaks, but you dream about peaks. or areas that can even be recurring dreams. But I'm old enough that some of the topo maps that I was using in Wyoming and southern Utah were pretty inaccurate, so that the reality in the maps weren't the same thing. And that was always a really intriguing and fun thing to figure out. And aha, that's wrong. That's not there. I wonder if Katie ever gets Reisenstein's Coming to the Alpinist. I'll bet you get hoax root claims, but Reisenstein's and the moderns, with satellite views and everything, it'd be pretty hard to pull off.
Yeah, I had a long back and forth with like Steve Svensson and Hrish Kapadia about, would it be possible for somebody to create an imaginary mountain in some part of the Karakoram where it's hard to get good maps? And I think the conclusion was that with satellite imagery and every other sort of modern technology, that it would be hard to pull off an actual mountain, but maybe like a steep mountain face could be pulled off. But all of that depends on how much research the editors of climbing magazines do. I got kind of paranoid about the whole thing after publishing the book, and I got a very real letter to the editor about a very real expedition, and it was just like a funny sounding name. And my first thought was like, this is someone who's read the book and they're trying to like pull a hoax off on me. So, but yeah, I'm sure.
There's a comment in the chat from Kelly. One of the things I loved about the book was the reminder that indeed I've always sort of been on the lookout for imaginary peaks. What is around the next bend? She asks. So she's just agreeing with you. Does the alpinist, or maybe you don't have to tell us in this question, have any plans to create an imaginary peak? I mean, as what you were saying about imagining a world that you want, like, is there a way, maybe Katie, does Katie have an imaginary peak in the way to imagine how she wants the world to be?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. In Alpinist 75, we published an article by Passing Yanje Sherpa, who's an anthropologist, and she talked about how mountains are metaphors. And so if you're going to talk about how you would like to climb a mountain, that inherently becomes a metaphor for how you would like to live. If you talk about how you would like the future of mountaineering to look, it inevitably becomes a metaphor for how you would like the future of the world to appear, which I thought was a really interesting thing, that there is this sort of inherently kind of metaphorical quality about real mountains to people. And that's one reason why people sort of care about how you approach them and how you talk about them. Yeah, I mean, we did, back issue 54, we did a big feature on imaginary mountains. Beyond that, yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly something that could come up again.
Does anyone have questions for Katie while you're thinking about your imaginary peak experiences?
I had one interviewer once asked me if I would ever, my friends and I would ever try to pull off a hoax like Harvey Manning, and it turned into this like long thread on my Facebook page. And then all of a sudden one of my friends was like, wait, if we actually do this, we don't want to leave evidence. So like deleted all the comments.
Chuck Harris asks in the chat, Katie, what is next?
Immediately, I have an Alpha's deadline next week. So yeah, my immediate future looks like proofreading and fact checking and fixing photo captions. But yeah, beyond that, I'd like to write more books, definitely. I've got, there's an idea I'm already really excited about, so I'm just scheming to, I'd like to, one of the things that happened when I was working on this book is because it happened, the bulk of the time that I took off from work to work on it corresponded perfectly with the lockdowns of the pandemic. I ended up spending most of the time in a house on Montana, imagining mountains and looking at mountains and sort of wandering about mountains, but not getting to travel to as many of the places I was writing about that I wanted to. And I think for the next book, one of the things I really want to do is actually travel to all the places that I'm going to write about. So that's my scheming, is to kind of figure out how to do that.
I have lots of questions, but does anyone, okay, here's another chat. I live in Seattle, and it was so fun to learn about more about the character that was Harvey Manning. Cougar Mountain is our close in hiking spot. So now I'm curious that there are some secret places there to find.
Oh, I'm sure there are. I mean, yeah, he spent a lot of time there, and he left behind a huge number of writings. I mean, I counted more than 125 boxes of unpublished writings. I mean, basically, it's like if an idea came into his mind and he wrote down a scrap of paper, he saved it. And so there's probably all kinds of, like, I only got through a fraction of the boxes, and there's probably all kinds of things to discover in there. There's definitely other hoaxes, and yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of, I've managed to hike at Cougar Mountain, was one of the places that I was able to visit during a trip in 2019. And I hiked around the Harvey Manning Trail, which of course was named after his death. And it was interesting. I remember it like crossed with another trail called the Shangri-La Trail. And so you used to see these kind of repetitions of place names from the mythology of imaginary mountains. The other thing that Harvey did is he wrote dozens of guidebooks, many of them with Iris Spring, to mountains in the Cascades. And he, particularly towards the end of his life, as he got worried about certain places becoming too crowded, he deliberately left places out, but he would sort of plant these odd clues about how you could, that would kind of point you in the right direction of the secret place. There was one entry in like his Alpine Lakes book where he's like, if you're sick of crowds, he's like, stay away from lakes. He's like, avoid them altogether. And then he starts talking about like how, you could sort of go past this one lake and kind of nose around and you might find something, and so there was a lot of these kind of like hints and subtle clues of hidden places that you could find.
Oh, Chuck wants you to ask my questions in the chat. Okay, so one way I guess I imagine my imaginary mountains is the effects of climate change. How has the effect of climate change affected the imaginary peaks? Like imagining what things will look like when the glaciers are melted, the forests don't exist, that kind of thing. Have you come across those kinds of dystopian imaginary peaks, or how does climate change factor into imaginary peaks?
Definitely. I mean, as people know, the climate change has dramatically altered the landscapes of mountains, and there's actual spires that have crumbled, rock walls that have changed, roots that have changed. So all of that is sort of transforming the real landscapes. I think one of the things that is interesting is that places that used to be real are now purely imaginary places, like the Lillian Glacier, where Harvey went on one of his formative camping experiences. He got stuck in a rainstorm, and they were like 23 miles from the trailhead. He was with a bunch of Boy Scouts, and they were all wearing cotton, and somehow they didn't like freeze to death. That the Lillian Glacier is gone. So this place that played such an important, real place that played such an important role in his life, is now an imaginary place. And at the same time, places that were once thought of as imaginary, you think of like the famous myth of the Northwest Passage as this like open navigatable waterway across the Arctic. And now there are years when the Northwest Passage is real. So yeah, I mean, I think the world that we live is very much in flux in that sense. And climate change was something that Ed and Austin and Harvey were all aware of, I think, more towards the end of their lives. In glacier ice, when Ed and Austin were first working glacier ice, which is how they came across the photos that resulted in the Riesenstein hoax in the first place, that was around the time that scientists were trying to understand the relationships between the size of glaciers and fluctuations in the climate. So it was like very much in this kind of early stages of climate change science becoming more understood and becoming more mainstream gradually. And then the very last book that Harvey wrote Wilderness Alps, which is a history of conservation in the North Cascades, he talks about this sort of just sense of horror of kind of looking into the crystal ball and imagining a future in which every place that he loved and was fighting so hard to protect from logging, to protect from mining, to protect from overdevelopment, every place was perfectly protected, only to be destroyed by climate change. And it's sort of sad to think of that as kind of like one of the last imagined visions of his life, which of course is becoming all too real. He died in 2006.
Bruce puts in the chat, in my middle grade novel that was published last summer, I created a world of imaginary peaks. It was fun to narratively create mountains I've only seen in my mind.
Oh, that's great.
Okay, there's no other questions. I have another question. Oh, there's a nice big chat. Let's see. Neil says, Katie, I love your appreciation of topography and geography. It seems to me that much of mountaineering is on the edge of imagination. Some peaks and faces inspire us and others do not. I call this vision. We ask ourselves some question, maybe something like, I wonder if I could do that ridge in good style. Many climbers try to answer questions like this. This is about answering mysteries for ourselves. All mountain ranges then hold imaginary mountains.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And yeah, it's certainly true. I mean, it's, you look at a map and it's you start to sort of, it starts to tell a story. Like you sort of imagine yourself traveling to this peak or, following this river and kind of wondering what the real place might look like. And there's something that's inherently kind of story generating about being in the mountains. It's something that, I talk a lot about with the writers that I work with, that the very shape of a mountain reflects the shape of a traditional narrative arc. It's like you start at the trailhead, you kind of rise up to the top of the peak, which resembles that sort of rising tension in a story arc towards a climactic moment. And then you come back down again, all goes well. And so there is this something about, it's like you go out into the mountains of any size and any kind of day, and you're coming back with a story, you're living a story, you're creating a story. And I think that's maybe one reason why so many people who are readers and writers are drawn to mountaineering, because it is that chance to kind of live out your own story.
How has researching this book affected your interactions in the mountains?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, I guess maybe it's given me sort of more layers of mythology to think about, more questions to ask. It's certainly I'm one of those people who has recurring dreams at night of imaginary mountains, and those dreams have definitely gotten like more intense and more vivid since I became so obsessed with studying them during my waking hours. And yeah, I think I've sort of, maybe it's given me more of a sense of ways that, real places can also seem enchanted. I developed this obsession during the pandemic with watching the sunset from the tops of mountains. And, certainly it's like every sunset is different, and every peak lit up by different qualities of sunset and twilight light is a completely new peak, and the sort of moments of, particularly in the wintertime and like when there's a lot of rime and you sort of see the alpenglow go from yellow to gold to pink to crimson to violet. And it's like you're watching the world just come alive in this incredibly magic way. And it's there, it's just very temporary, and it will never look the same a second time. So that's my other kind of, that's another kind of imaginary mountain, I guess, that I've come to experience more since the book.
Thank you. Any other questions? Feel free to unmute yourself. All right. Any last words, Katie?
Yikes, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, people have other questions, I'm very easy to find. I'm just katie@alpinist.com. And, I love hearing people's stories about, like dream mountains and imagined mountains, or, other places that, would be worth doing research into. And, I keep saying I'm done with imaginary mountains, but I'm clearly not. So if anyone has stories to share, keep in touch.
Well, as like you said, that everything is subjective anyway, so it's all imaginary
Yeah,
on some level.
yeah, definitely.
Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you, Katie. The next Mountain Story event is March 2nd with David Gonzalez talking about his picnic evolution of his kind of triathlons in the mountains. So another imagining a way to interact in the mountains. But thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Katie, and thank you for showing up.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Have a good night.